here is Henry VIII's tomb, and they know that in there are the bodies of Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. Now that is an interesting topic on its own, because there is a lost tomb of Henry VIII.
In 1813, workmen at Windsor Castle were just trying to fix a floor. They were digging in the choir of St. George's Chapel when their shovels hit something hard. It was not dirt and it was not stone. They had accidentally punched a hole into a forgotten black void. When they lowered a lantern into the darkness, the light revealed a scene of absolute chaos. There was no gold, no dignity, and no peace. Instead, they saw a royal coffin that had literally exploded from the inside out. The King of England was not sleeping. He was a mess. Beneath the choir stalls. It was a cold day in April of 1813. The Napoleonic Wars were raging across Europe, but inside the quiet stone walls of Windsor Castle, a different kind of history was about to be exposed. Workmen were busy in St. George's Chapel, tasked with making a passage to a new royal tomb house. It was routine construction work. It was dusty, loud, and completely ordinary. That is, until the floor gave way. The workers had accidentally breached a stone vault located directly under the choir. This was not on the blueprints they were using, it was a surprise. The opening was small, just a jagged gap in the masonry, but it was wide enough to see through. The air that drifted up from that black hole was stale. It was the air of a room that had been sealed tight for more than 160 years. Naturally, the work stopped immediately. The superintendent of the works was called, and soon news reached the Prince Regent. This was a major event. You see, for generations, people had argued about where exactly Henry VIII was buried. Some said he was at Westminster. Others said he was at Windsor, but nobody knew the exact spot. The location had been lost to time, erased by the chaos of civil wars and renovations. Now, quite by accident, the mystery was solved. But here is the catch. The Prince Regent did not just want to mark the spot on a map, he wanted to see it. He wanted to know what was down there. So, a small group of officials, including the royal physician Sir Henry Halford, gathered around the hole. They lowered lanterns into the gloom, squinting against the flickering light. What they saw made them gasp. It was not a neat, orderly row of royal sarcophagi. It was a scene of destruction. In the center of the cramped vault lay a massive coffin, but it was not resting peacefully. It was battered. The wooden outer case had shattered into splinters, leaving the lead inner shell exposed. And the lead itself was torn open. It looked as if a giant hand had crushed it, or as if something violent had burst out from the inside. This was the final resting place of King Henry VIII. The man who had reshaped religion, beheaded queens, and terrified Europe was lying in a broken heap. To the right of the king lay another coffin, this one covered in purple velvet that had faded but remained intact. This was Queen Jane Seymour, the wife Henry claimed to love the most, probably because she died before he had a chance to grow tired of her. Her coffin was peaceful, undisturbed. On the left there was a third coffin. It was simple, covered in black velvet with a silver plate that barely caught the lantern light. This belonged to King Charles I, the monarch who had lost his head to the executioner's axe in 1649. And perched precariously on top of Charles was a tiny lead box, the coffin of a stillborn child from the reign of Queen Anne. The scene was claustrophobic. It was messy. It was disrespectful. The great Henry VIII, who had demanded the finest things in life, was rotting in a hole that looked more like a crime scene than a royal crypt. The wood was decayed, the metal was ripped, and the king's remains were exposed to the damp air of the vault. The crazy part is that this damage was not caused by grave robbers. No jewels were missing. The vault had been sealed for over a century. The destruction had happened in total silence, in the dark, with nobody watching. Sir Henry Halford, the physician, was given permission to examine the contents. He carefully moved closer to the wreckage of Henry's coffin. He peered inside the jagged tear in the lead. He saw bones. He saw what looked like the remnants of a beard, but mostly he saw the results of a biological catastrophe. This discovery changed everything we thought we knew about the glorious end of the Tudor dynasty. It stripped away the gold paint and the propaganda. It showed the world that even the most powerful men are just flesh and bone, and when you seal a large body in a tight metal box, physics takes over. But the question on everyone's mind was simple. How did it end up like this? How did the king who spent a fortune on his legacy end up in a crowded, broken basement? To understand that, we have to go back to the beginning. We have to look at the massive ego of the man who planned a tomb that would rival the wonders of the ancient world and how he failed to build even a basic headstone. The silence of the vault held the answer to a mystery that was centuries in the making. And what they found inside that lead shell was far worse than just dry bones. The Vanity Project. Henry VIII was not a man of small ambitions. He did not just want to be a king, he wanted to be an icon. Throughout his reign, he built palaces, he built a navy, and he built a reputation as a warrior scholar. So it makes sense that he wanted his death to be just as loud as his life. Years before he died, Henry began planning his tomb. He did not start from scratch, though. In true Henry fashion, he stole it. The original design belonged to Cardinal Thomas Wolsey. Wolsey was Henry's right-hand man for years, the most powerful churchman in England. Wolsey had commissioned an incredible sarcophagus for himself. He hired Italian sculptors, including the famous Benedetto da Rovezzano. He imported black touchstone and white marble. He wanted a monument that would make the Pope jealous. But then Wolsey messed up. He failed to get Henry his divorce from Catherine of Aragon. Henry turned on him. Wolsey fell from grace, lost all his titles, and died before the king could execute him. Henry, never one to let good marble go to waste, seized Wolsey's property. He looked at the half-finished tomb and decided it was nice, but it needed to be bigger, much bigger. Henry's vision for this tomb was insane. We have the descriptions from the time, and the numbers are staggering. He wanted a podium adorned with 134 statues. 134! These were not small figurines. We are talking about life-size bronze statues of the apostles, prophets, and evangelists. He wanted angels holding candlesticks that stood 9 feet tall. Imagine the scale of this. A 9-foot candlestick is taller than the ceiling in most modern houses, and he wanted 4 of them. On top of the sarcophagus, Henry planned for a life-sized effigy of himself and Jane Seymour. But he wasn't going to be lying down in eternal sleep like most kings. No, Henry wanted to be depicted as wide awake, kneeling, presumably praying, but definitely looking powerful. He also wanted a statue of himself on horseback under a massive triumphal arch like a Roman emperor. The entire thing was going to be covered in gold leaf, black marble, and bronze. It was going to be placed in a dedicated chapel at Windsor, a shrine to the Tudor dynasty that people would visit for 1,000 years. The cost was astronomical. In today's money, we are talking about tens of millions of dollars. The bronze work alone would have taken decades to cast and polish. Work actually began on this monstrosity. The Italian sculptors chipped away at the marble. The metalworkers cast the bronze. Pieces of this giant puzzle were scattered all over workshops in Westminster. But here is the catch. Henry ran out of money. He was fighting wars in France. He was fighting wars in Scotland. He was building coastal fortresses. The royal treasury, which was overflowing when his father died, was running on fumes. Henry kept telling the artists to keep working, but he stopped paying the bills on time. Then Henry died in 1547. St. George's Chapel temporarily. He wrote that his body should be moved to the magnificent tomb once it was finished. He described the tomb as almost complete. That was a lie, he told himself. The tomb was nowhere near complete. It was a pile of expensive parts. After Henry died, his son Edward VI took the throne. Edward was a child. He, or rather his advisors, had no interest in spending a fortune on a tomb for his scary father. Then came Mary, then Elizabeth. None of his children wanted to finish the job. It was too expensive, and frankly, the political climate had changed. The grand Catholic-style monument Henry wanted didn't fit with the new Protestant England. So the parts sat in a warehouse. They gathered dust. Thieves stole bits of the bronze. The marble was chipped. Eventually, during the English Civil War, the parliamentarians needed money to fight the king. They looked at the bronze statues intended for Henry's tomb and saw quick cash. They melted them down. The beautiful angels, the apostles, the image of Henry himself, all tossed into the furnace to make cannons and coins. The black marble sarcophagus, the stone box Wolsey had ordered and Henry had stolen, survived. But it was empty. Centuries later, it was finally used. It is the very same black box that Lord Nelson is buried in today at St. Paul's Cathedral. So, the grandest tomb in English history was sold for scrap metal. And Henry, he was left in the temporary hole in the floor. The temporary solution became permanent. The man who wanted 134 statues got a broken floor tile. The king, who wanted to be bathed in the light of 9-foot candles, was left in the dark. It is a humiliation that Henry would have executed someone for suggesting while he was alive. But the dead cannot sign death warrants. They can only rot. And as Henry lay there waiting for a monument that would never come, he was about to get some company he really did not want. Crashing into history. If there was one thing Henry hated, it was rebellion. He believed that kings were appointed by God. To defy a king was to defy God. So you can imagine how he would have felt about Charles I. Charles I was the King of England over a century after Henry. He got into a massive war with his own parliament. He lost. He was put on trial for treason, a king on trial, which was unheard of, and he was found guilty. On a cold January day in 1649, Charles walked out onto a balcony in London and had his head chopped off. Now, the parliamentarians, led by Oliver Cromwell, had a problem. They had a dead king. They didn't want to bury him in Westminster Abbey because they were afraid his grave would become a shrine for royalists. They needed somewhere quiet, somewhere out of the way, somewhere secure. They chose Windsor. The funeral was a rushed, sad affair. It was snowing heavily. Witnesses said that as the soldiers carried Charles's coffin across the castle grounds, the black velvet pall turned white with snow. They called him the White King because of it. They brought the coffin into St. George's Chapel. They had no idea where to dig. Remember, there were no maps. They tapped on the floor, listening for a hollow sound. Eventually, they found a vault in the middle of the choir. They pried open the stones, they looked inside and saw 2 coffins. One was huge, Henry, one was smaller, Jane Seymour. They decided this was the place. There was not much time and they didn't really care about being polite. They lowered Charles's coffin into the hole. But here is the catch. The vault was tiny. It was not designed for 3 people. The soldiers and workmen struggled. Charles's coffin was heavy, lined with lead, just like Henry's. They tried to maneuver it into position next to Henry. This is where things get interesting. When the vault was opened in 1813 and again sketched in 1888, the damage to Henry's coffin was obvious. The center of Henry's coffin had been smashed in. Some historians believe that during this rushed burial in 1649, the workers might have dropped Charles. Or maybe they used Henry's coffin as a step. Or perhaps they simply shoved Charles's coffin down so hard that it banged against Henry's, shattering the wood and denting the lead. Imagine the scene. A group of men who had just eliminated a king, trying to hide the body in a hurry, struggling in a dark hole, standing on the remains of the old tyrant Henry to make room for the new victim Charles. It was the ultimate insult. Henry, who hated the Scots, Charles was a Stuart, a Scottish line, was now forced to spend eternity rubbing shoulders with one. When the artist A.Y. Nutt went down there in 1888 to draw the layout, he captured this chaos perfectly. His sketch shows the cramped conditions, it shows the splintered wood, it shows the absolute lack of respect. Queen Anne's baby was added later, just tossed on top of Charles because there was literally no floor space left. It is a dysfunctional family reunion in the worst possible way. You have the wife monster, the beloved wife who died young, the executed traitor king, and a tragic baby. All jammed together in a stone box under the floor where the choir sings every Sunday. But while the clumsy burial of Charles might explain the broken wood, it does not fully explain the exploded lead. The crazy part is that a lead coffin does not just break from a bump. Lead is soft. It bends. For the metal to tear open like it did, for it to look like it had burst, requires a different kind of force. It requires pressure, and that pressure came from the very thing the lead was supposed to contain. The king was not just resting, he was brewing. The soup inside. Let's talk about chemistry for a second. When a human body dies, it breaks down. It produces gases: methane, hydrogen sulfide, ammonia. If a body is buried in the dirt, these gases escape into the soil. It is natural. But for royalty, natural was not good enough. They wanted to be preserved. They wanted to look like they were just sleeping. So the embalmers would come in. In the 16th century, embalming was not great. They would remove the internal organs and replace them with spices and sawdust to soak up the fluids. They would wrap the body in cerecloth, fabric dipped in wax and resin. Then, to be absolutely sure the king was safe, they would put him in a lead coffin. They would solder the seam shut, making it airtight. Then they would put that inside a wooden coffin. The idea was to keep the air out to stop the decay. But here is the catch: you can never get all the bacteria out. The anaerobic bacteria, the kind that does not need oxygen, start to work. They eat the remains, they produce gas. In an airtight lead coffin, that gas has nowhere to go. Henry VIII was a big man. By the time he died, he weighed close to 300 pounds. He was full of edema, fluid retention, from his leg ulcers and poor health. That means there was a lot of organic material to break down. As the days and weeks passed, the pressure inside that lead box began to climb. It turned into a pressure cooker. We have a historical account that hints this started happening almost immediately. After Henry died in London, his body was transported to Windsor in a grand procession. It was a long journey. They stopped for the night at Sion Abbey. The coffin was placed in the church. According to a contemporary chronicle, the next morning the attendants found the coffin leaking. A mixture of blood and bodily fluids had seeped through the lead and dripped onto the floor. The story goes that a plumber came to solder the leak. But while the coffin was unattended, stray dogs wandered into the church. They found the puddle under the coffin, and they licked it up. This was seen as a divine judgment. Henry had dissolved the monasteries. Sion Abbey was a religious house. For the dogs to desecrate his remains on holy ground was seen as God's punishment for his sins. Whether the dog part is true or just a grim legend, the leaking part is chemically probable. The pressure was already forcing fluids out through the microscopic pores or weak spots in the solder. Once he was in the vault at Windsor, the process continued. The gases built up. The lead, which is a ductile metal, would have started to bulge. It would have rounded out, looking like a balloon. Eventually, the structural integrity failed. Maybe it happened 10 years later, maybe 50. But at some point, the pressure became too much for the solder seams. Boom! It wouldn't have been a fiery explosion, but a pneumatic rupture. The lead ripped open. The trapped gases rushed out into the vault. The wooden outer casing, already weakened by the damp and maybe the weight of Charles's coffin, shattered from the force of the expansion and the sudden release. So when the workmen looked down in 1813, they weren't just seeing a broken box. They were seeing the aftermath of a biological detonation. The king had effectively turned into a gas bomb. What was left inside after the rupture was likely a grim mixture of bones and a dry sludge. The goo that leaked out would have dried up over the centuries, leaving a stain on the floor of the vault. It is a disgusting image. We are used to seeing Henry in his portraits, big, strong, covered in jewels, staring defiantly at the viewer. We don't like to think of him as a pressurized bag of gas exploding in a basement. But that is the reality of biology. It is the great equalizer. The thing most people don't realize is that this happened to other kings too. William the Conqueror's body was too big for his stone sarcophagus. When they tried to force him in, his stomach burst, and the smell was so bad that the mourners ran out of the church. Henry's explosion was slower, contained in the dark, but just as violent. So we have a king who failed to build his monument, a king who was crushed by a rival he hated, and a king who physically blew up. And that leads us to the final question. Why do we leave him there? Why, with all our modern science, do we let this mystery sit under a few inches of stone? A legacy of silence. Today, we have technology that Sir Henry Halford could only dream of back in 1813. We aren't just talking about flashlights and sketches anymore. We are talking about the kind of forensic science that solves cold cases from decades ago. We have fiber optic cameras flexible enough to snake through the tiniest cracks in masonry. We have LiDAR scanning that can map a cavity without ever touching a stone. We have DNA testing that can sequence a genome from a fragment of bone no bigger than a grain of rice. We even have facial reconstruction software that can take a skull and show us exactly what a man looked like on the day he died. Technologically speaking, the mystery of Henry VIII is solvable. We could, in theory, drill a hole the size of a pencil into the floor of St. George's Chapel. We could drop a camera down into the gloom of the vault. We could look right inside the jagged rip in Henry's lead coffin. We could see exactly what is left of the most infamous king in history. We could finally answer the questions that have fueled arguments for 500 years. Was it really syphilis that drove him mad? We could test the bone marrow and know for sure. Did he suffer from McLeod syndrome, a genetic disorder that caused his wives to miscarry and his mind to unravel? A simple DNA test would settle that debate instantly. We could verify if the leg injuries from his jousting accident were truly as catastrophic as the chronicles say. We could even confirm if the tiny coffin tucked away nearby really holds the child of Queen Anne, or if it belongs to someone else entirely. We have the tools to correct the history books once and for all. We could separate the man from the myth in an afternoon. So why don't we? The answer is complicated. It isn't just about logistics. It is a messy mix of intense respect, royal protocol, and a little bit of fear. You see, the British royal family is incredibly protective of their dead. To the public, St. George's Chapel is a tourist attraction, but to the Windsors, these vaults are not museums, they are family graves. You have to remember that Queen Elizabeth II was buried in this very same chapel, in a different vault just a few yards away from Henry. To crack open Henry's grave now would be seen as a violation of sanctity. It sets a dangerous precedent. If you let the scientists poke around Henry, who is next? Do we dig up Victoria? Do we exhume George VI? The Crown views this as a slippery slope. They operate on the principle that once a monarch is buried, they stay buried. But there is another reason, one that is rarely spoken about out loud. There is a sense that the mystery is actually better than the truth. Right now, Henry VIII is a legend. He is a monster, a lover, a warrior, and a tyrant. He is a larger-than-life figure who dominates our imagination. But if we open that box and just find a pile of brown dust and some rusty lead, the magic fades. We are left with the undeniable, ugly proof of mortality. When you strip away the crown and the robes, a king is just biology, and biology is brutal. If we look into that coffin, we aren't going to see a king. We are going to see a mess. The crazy part is, we actually know what that mess looks like. There hasn't been an official opening of the vault since 1813, but the accounts from that day are haunting. The sketch made in 1888 was done through a small observation hole, not a full exhumation, but it confirmed the chaos. So, Henry sits there. Every single year, thousands upon thousands of tourists walk through St. George's Chapel. They shuffle through the nave, looking up at the ceiling. They look at the colorful banners of the Garter Knights hanging in the air. They admire the stained glass catching the afternoon light. They walk right over the black marble slab in the center of the choir. Most of them have absolutely no idea what is directly beneath the soles of their shoes. They don't realize that just a few feet down, the scene is something out of a horror movie. They don't know about the splintered wood. They don't know about the exploded lead. They don't know that the massive, powerful Henry VIII is spooning with the headless body of Charles I. It is the ultimate contrast. Above the floor, everything is pomp and ceremony. It is gold, velvet, incense, and hymns. It is the image of stability and order. Below the floor, it is chaos, rot, and destruction. Henry VIII spent his entire life trying to control every single aspect of his world. He controlled the church. He rewrote the laws. He controlled the lives and deaths of his 6 wives. He tried to control the future of England by forcing a male heir into existence. He was a man who could not tolerate being told no. But in the end, he couldn't even control the pressure in his own coffin. He wanted to be remembered as a godlike figure, a modern Caesar. He drafted plans for a tomb that would rival the wonders of the ancient world. He wanted bronze statues, towering monuments, and eternal candles burning in his honor. He didn't get any of that. He got a hole in the ground and a roommate who lost the Civil War. History remembers him as a man, and biology remembers him as organic matter that followed the laws of physics. When the gas is built up inside that sealed lead shell, the laws of physics didn't care that he was the King of England. The coffin burst open just the same. But here is the catch. Henry might have actually appreciated the fear that keeps the vault sealed today. Even in death, even as a broken skeleton in a ruined box, he still commands attention. We are still talking about him, debating him, and making content about him 500 years later. Maybe that is the monument he really wanted. Not the bronze statues or the tall candles, but the infamy, the sheer weight of his presence. So what do you think? Should we use modern technology to peek inside the vault and solve the medical mysteries of Henry VIII? Or should we let the sleeping king and his exploded coffin rest in peace? It is a tough call. Let me know your verdict in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into royal secrets, hit that like button and subscribe for more history that they didn't teach you in school.